Good afternoon. Welcome to the Financial and Legal Issues for Churches. I'm Rob Fairley. I work for you at the United Methodist Foundation of Louisiana. This is the second, I guess, in a two-part series and a successful return of a previous presenter. Reverend Nate Berneking is the Director of Finance and Administrative Ministries for the Missouri Annual Conference, basically the treasurer of the conference. Went to seminary at Emory. He practiced law as a corporate attorney. He served in local churches for I think 7 or 8 years, but has been in his current role for longer than that. So he brings both the aspect of the layperson, clergy, and professional expertise to this topic. He's helped us in the past. We've been most grateful, and frankly, he's always received rave reviews. So Nate, this better be really, really good. He is going to take over here in just a second. If you have any questions during the presentation, if you'll just enter them in the chat section, and he will address them at the end of the presentation. Now, the one we did 2 days ago, which focused more on clergy taxes and so forth, is on our website. This one will be posted there as well later this week, or this is about as late in the week as we can get, so shortly. And all the information that he presents will be available just within the next couple of days. We'll be sending it out. So without further ado, Nate, thanks once again, and it's all yours.
Yeah, Rob, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody, and everybody who's with me live. I am incredibly impressed that you have logged on a Friday afternoon. And so to give you some idea where I'm going today, the presentation will probably be around 90 minutes. I'll try to do my best to keep it right there. Depends a little on the number of questions that get asked. I'm gonna, Rob sort of gave my background. I'm an attorney. I do not claim to be an accountant, although I oversee an accounting staff here in the Missouri Annual Conference. I'm gonna talk about a few financial items, but for the most part, I'm gonna talk about legal issues. And every time I've come to Louisiana, I'm always kind of asked to talk about some pitfalls that churches, and in part one, I talk about pitfalls that clergy might have with their taxes. And in this presentation, I am going to talk about several pitfalls that churches might experience with respect to legal issues. And I'm going to specifically talk about, because I was asked to, and it's a really popular topic of questions that I get in my office. So I am certain that it is really common in your annual conference as well. I'm going to talk about preschools and Mother's Day Out programs and just a host of different legal financial issues, accounting issues that come up in those sorts of ministries, because they can be really rewarding ministries, but they can also be really, well, they expose churches to a lot of risk. And not that there's anything wrong with some risk, but it is helpful if you know what the risks are. So that's kind of where I'm going to go today. Rob said it there. If you look on the Zoom platform, there are a couple of places here. One is a Q&A module. Let's not use the Q&A. Let's use the chat function. If you have a question, just write your question in the chat, and you can do that at any time while I'm presenting. I actually will take breaths throughout the presentation and read through those questions in the chat and try to respond. I may say, okay, I'm going to answer that in a later part of the presentation, but you get the idea. If you just put that in the chat, I will kind of be watching it and should be able to respond as we go. I'm gonna make the moment in a Zoom webinar that's always anxiety producing for me. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Let's see if I can make it work. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that, and I will take my PowerPoint into presenter mode. So that is my name. That is my title. It's great to be with you all today. I said this Tuesday when I presented to the clergy that I really appreciate getting to do this by Zoom. It is kind of the way of life these days. But it's great. I didn't have to get on an airplane to come and visit you, but I got to tell you that Louisiana is one of my favorite places to visit. So I sort of regret not being live in Baton Rouge or another city in Louisiana. I think last time I was in Shreveport, and I've also been in Monroe with you all. So kind of miss being down there. Well, I'm going to start today with an opening devotion, maybe devotion-like. And I've titled my devotion 3 Warnings and 3 Encouragements. And I think I could also call it the 6 B's or maybe the 7 B's. You'll see why in a minute. And 3 of the B's are bewares. First thing I tell you to beware of, and I will actually, believe it or not, I will get to some scripture here in just a few minutes with this devotion. I tell you, beware of spectacle. And that really goes for legal issues, but it goes for life in general. I think we as a country have been taken a little bit with the idea of spectacle. We really like watching spectacles. We like to watch them on TV. We like to watch them on our computers. We like to hear about them. Well, actually, I'm going to use an author, a Nobel Prize winning author from Peru, Mario Vargas Llosa. He wrote a book called Notes on the Death of Culture, and he defined spectacle a little bit. And he has this great sentence that the spectacle is the effective dictator of illusion. And his whole point is, look, we in Western culture, and this is, I think, especially true in the United States, we have this idea that things or stuff, commodities, things, our possessions, they tend to control us as human beings. And that really is an illusion, but we've developed this kind of fetish for things and ownership. So we want, we buy, we work to create more. And so all of that means that it sort of drives us to a sense of boredom. And I think that sense of boredom, it leads us to do all sorts of things. And a lot of those, it drives us to be fascinated with spectacle, but it drives us what Christians would refer to as idolatry. And that's my second beware. And you will see how this all comes together for my legal presentation in just a minute. Spectacle and I beware of idolatry. My professor at Emory, Luke Timothy Johnson, he has this idea that we as human beings are natural idolaters. If left, I mean, you can think about that as original sin. We sort of associate ourselves with things. And I always use the example, this is actually a really charming thing. My great-grandmother and her sister, so my great-great-aunt, sister is plural, aunts, my mother is from North Georgia, and they all lived in North Georgia. They were rural people, and they were quilters because that is what women did through the Depression era. And they made quilts, and a lot of you will know this, especially those of you who are originally from the South will know this, that back in the Depression, throughout the US, but especially in the South, that women actually used, it was really common to use cloth flour sacks. Actually, they were encouraged to do so by the government and by the flour, the mills that package the flour. And well, I have several of these quilts that my great-grandmother and her sisters quilted. And one in particular, I have slept under every night for, I don't know, more than 20 years now. And that quilt is more than just a quilt to me. I have associated with that quilt all of this family heritage and ancestry and sort of the pride I have in my family and their ability to make things and make beautiful things. And as a result of that, I've largely associated myself, my own identity with that quilt. I've slept under it for 20 years. And that's a real charming example, but of a tendency that human beings have that I think can be a little bit dangerous, if you will. And I think Jesus latches on to this over and over. And that tendency is that we invest finite things with characteristics of the infinite, of things that are less finite. And so we use our wealth, and I suspect those of you who are in business administration and local churches, if I have pastors on, certainly you will have seen this. We as individuals do this, and our churches do this. We use our wealth as a means of self-preservation and protection. We want, we buy, we work to create more. It's the same thing that I talked about with my warning about spectacle. And I think you probably are beginning to see where maybe I'm going with this. The last beware might sound completely insane to you, but my last beware is to beware of church. Beware of, in particular, beware of those first two issues, spectacle and idolatry. Beware of those masquerading as ministry. I really think that spectacle and idolatry have too often seized the church and clergy and our laity in the church. We have these ideas that bigger is better. If you build it, they will come. Maybe you're in a church that has a building that has debt on it that you don't feel like the church can afford anymore. But churches, the size of churches, the size of salaries, the status that we all carry as clergy, but also as laity in our churches, that has all seized us. And there are these temptations of power. And those temptations of power drive people to anger. They drive them to sort of distorted understandings of wealth. We have these mentalities of scarcity. Our pastors think they're poorly compensated, and the laity they lead might think that they are overly compensated. We have, I think this one also happens in our churches all the time. We sort of hide behind these masks of false modesty and humility. All the while, the church is operating under these ideas that are really dangerous. Ideas about their size, their status, their wealth. And as a result of that, when it comes to legal issues, we get really anxious because legal issues are a threat to all of those things and therefore threaten the identities that we have that we associate it with those things. And so I've seen too often when it comes to legal issues and financial issues in churches, that you have you go down one of two paths and I think both paths are wrong turns. One path is you protect too much, put a wall up around the church and protect it from all risks whatsoever. You put a wall up around the church's finance and you won't let go of a dollar to even do a really compelling ministry. And then on the other path, we just, and this I think is the path that too many clergy take, we just want to ignore the kind of the fear. We want to bury our head in the sand and we want to pretend like everything is okay. And so here's my devotion, kind of where I'm going to conclude it. And that is with 3 more B's and maybe a 4th one. And I want to turn up to a little bit of scripture now. I'm not going to read it, but I am going to kind of retell it. Genesis 4, 1 through 16. If you're really good, you know that is the story of Cain and Abel. And I think that story is really powerful for several reasons. It is, and in some ways, I think it is maybe a more powerful description of the way sin works in our lives and in our world than the story that we associate with sin, which is the story of the forbidden fruit. The story of Cain and Abel, the story of 2 brothers. One brother is a farmer and one brother is a hunter, I guess you would say. And one of the brothers, both of the brothers, make an offering. God appears, whether God does or not, it's not clear, but God appears to favor one brother's offering over the other. And poor Cain, whose offering was not favored, begins to think about that a little too much. And in thinking about it, begins to feel as though his brother Abel has gotten more than his fair share, has gotten something that Cain at least deserved a portion of. And Cain begins to nurse those feelings. And God even warns Cain and says, Cain, you better be careful, because your anger, your resentment, it's like a predator lying in wait for you. And in fact, That's exactly what happens. Those feelings, his resentments get the better of him, and he rises up against his brother Abel and he kills him. He murders him. Now, what I think happened with respect to Cain is that his resentments blinded him. His desire to protect himself and to claim what he felt like he deserved blinded him to the other in his brother. Couldn't see anymore. He didn't see his brother. He saw someone who was taking advantage of him, who was getting special treatment. And that blindness is what I fear too often drives our churches towards spectacle, towards idolatry. And so those are my warnings. My first encouragement is always be mindful of the other, even in legal issues, even when you feel your church is threatened, even when you feel as though your church is taking on a risk. Do not lose sight of others, of their humanity. Even if they are angry at the church and making threats, they are still people. Never lose sight of the other. Be mindful of the self, the individual self especially, but the self of the whole congregation. And to always remember that ministry occurs through whole persons and through whole churches. The best ministries occur when the church brings all of itself to bear on that ministry. And then the sixth B and maybe the seventh, be mindful of what moves, and the seventh is between. Be aware of what's moving between the other and the self. Local churches, their existence, and I think actually individuals too, our existence is shaped by generosity, most profoundly. Generosity should drive everything we do. And more than, I don't just mean financial generosity. I talk a lot about financial generosity. Jesus certainly talks a lot about financial generosity. But really, it's about generosity of our entire selves. Ministry happens when the self and the other are sharing openly with one another. And I think that's really important when thinking about legal issues. It is too easy for a local church, for leaders in a local church, to allow fear, anxiety, desire for more, blindness to another person to drive decisions, especially in the legal and the financial arenas. And so my entire approach to advising churches on legal issues and on administrative and financial issues is to find some balance between, of course, we want to be good stewards. We want to ensure that the self is protected so that the self can continue to do the ministry that it's called to do, individual and collective self. But we never want to lose sight of why we actually exist, and that is that we exist for the other, for those in our local communities. And so I'm going to start kind of just flow right from my devotion right into kind of an introduction to legal issues. And overarching, when you have a legal issue, and even when you don't know that you or don't think you have a legal issue, you think you might have a legal issue, and I don't mean a legal conflict. Certainly this is true for threatened lawsuits and litigation or contractual disputes. But this goes for even when you don't seem to have an issue, when you're just maintaining a relationship. And we'll talk about some legal relationships in a minute that you may not be thinking about. But with respect to those relationships, to relationships that kind of pull on and trigger the legal or the financial or the administrative, you want to always be intentional, to be thinking about what you're doing, and to always give them attention. When I say intentional, be thinking about what you're doing. And that means always keeping an eye open. You may decide that a ministry that is really risky is absolutely what you are called to do as a local church. And that is okay. But be intentional about knowing what the risks are, understand what you're going into in undertaking that ministry. And don't ignore them. Give them the attention they need. The legal issues, give them the attention they need. Intentionality and intention and attention are really critical. If you give all legal issues those two things, you're going to go a long way to eliminating any kinds of risks of the really bad legal issues. So here's some do's and don'ts I put on a slide as some risks. You want to make sure you identify. I said a leader. I was thinking small church. Identify a couple of leaders, and if you're a larger church, several leaders with some know-how. They don't have to be lawyers. They don't have to be accountants. They don't have to have any specialized training at all. They just need some know-how. And really what they need to know how to do is to ask the right questions and to be intentional and to be attentive. So different, some professions to think of as leaders who can help with legal issues. They may not think they do, but business owners, they're dealing with legal issues every day. And they're successful business leaders are always intentional and always attentive to them. School administrators. I come from a family of teachers and administrators. They actually, they're not legal experts, but they're working in an environment every day in which they live and breathe attentiveness and intentionality to potential legal issues. Business owners, school administrators, teachers, you can probably think of a lot more. Simply identify a leader or multiple leaders who are willing to give of themselves towards intentionality and attentiveness. Always read your legal documents. And legal documents include things like copier leases, things you wouldn't otherwise want to read. You need to read them and you need to have a sense of them, all of them. Stay informed of your church's legal relationships. And when I say legal relationships, I mean it in the broadest possible way possible. Your legal relationships include things like, certainly, the copier company with whom you signed a lease. But beyond that, children in your children's ministry. Every person who comes onto your campus or into your building for worship, you actually have a legal relationship with them. Now, you don't have to obsess over it. It's okay. There's inherent risk in inviting them onto the property, and you have insurance for risks like that. But be attentive to it. That might mean you want to make sure that the handrails are all tight. It probably means that you want to have a really good policy in place. We call it, Missouri, we called it safe sanctuaries for years. We've moved to safe gatherings as a provider, as a trainer of how to protect children and vulnerable adults in our ministries. Every vulnerable adult, every child that's that's benefiting from your ministries, you have a legal relationship with them. Be attentive to it. They deserve your protection. So those are sorts of legal relationships you may not be thinking of, but they exist, and they need, you need to be informed, and you need to be intentional and attentive. Create a system of accountability. That might be the safe gatherings policy, but it might also be a system of reviewing contracts, a system of thinking about the legal issues during church council or trustees or finance meetings. Always maintain good files. Keep good notes. Keep files confidential, except when it's not appropriate to be confidential, and understand when that is. It's certainly, you don't ever want to be accused of hiding some sort of horrible event that occurred that and your hiding actually compounded the harm of the original event. And so that I don't know Louisiana's law on this, but that's things like child sex abuse. If you are in Missouri, you are required, if you have reasonable cause to believe that a child is being abused, if you're a volunteer with a local church, or if you're a church staff person, you are mandated by state law to make a report, not to keep it secret. So keep good files, write things down, take good notes, and know when to share them with somebody else. Don't, and this flows right in, don't pretend to know more than you do. Know when to ask an expert. Your conference office is a good resource. They may not have the answer immediately. They may have to call the conference chancellor. They may have to refer you to another attorney, but know when you don't know so that you ask an expert to get involved. Don't procrastinate. If you're getting letters from the IRS, if you're getting letters from your Secretary of State, you need to act on them. You need to make sure you address them. Procrastination, putting your head in the sand, only makes things worse in the world of legal issues. And then finally, don't assume everything's just going to work out. I promise you, it almost never does. It requires attention and intentionality to address it. Now, at this point in the presentation, I'm going to kind of dive into some very specific issues. And I'm going to hit a lot. I'm going to talk about, we're going to start with corporate law and tax law, which kind of hang together, even though they're separate. I'm going to talk about some employment matters. I'm going to talk about, I said, preschools and Mother's Day Out programs, but I'm also going to talk about some real estate and even some contract law to think about. And all along, I'm going to give you really specific areas where I see churches making mistakes or stumbling over legal issues. First of all, corporate and tax law. First, you need to understand they're different. They're not the same thing. And you're going to see in a minute, just because you use the language of 501c3 or nonprofit, you're not talking about the same thing. A corporation is actually a form of legal relationship. The idea was created, 150 years ago, maybe a little longer. And states have all adopted statutes. They exist in the business world. We all know corporations exist in the business world. We hear about them on the news all the time. But even very small businesses have corporations. They are essentially the relationships that protect an owner, or in the case of a nonprofit, members, from the liabilities and the claims, the things, the debts of the corporation itself. Well, I think every state now has adopted some form of what's called the Uniform Nonprofit Corporations Act. Louisiana has, you have this statute, and I actually did a little research on Louisiana law to make sure I wasn't completely out of the ballpark. In order to create a corporation, what happens is the members or the owners, with nonprofits, it's members, they incorporate by filing a document called Articles of Incorporation with their state's Secretary of State. Sometimes it's a different office, but in Louisiana, it's the Secretary of State. I looked it up. And actually, you can visit the Secretary of State's website. It's sos.la.gov. It is like in Missouri, it's sos.mo.gov. You can visit your Secretary of State's website, and you can actually search for corporations. And so if your church is already incorporated, you can find it, the record of that on the Secretary of State's website. Secretary of State, to maintain that corporation, to maintain its existence, to protect the members from the debts of the corporation, you have to file annual reports and usually pay fees. Now, the fees aren't very much, $25 or so, but you do that every year. So here's the idea. In the church, if somebody comes to the church for a potluck and you serve them some fried chicken and then the chicken was undercooked and they actually get a really bad case of food poisoning, and they end up getting really sick and hospitalized, they could bring a claim against the local church. How do I know this? Well, because I had a church in Missouri where this very thing happened. Now, but for corporate law and the idea of a corporation, it's not likely to happen even if you don't have a corporation, but it could. Theoretically, the person who got sick could bring their claim for damages against everybody who was involved in the planning of the meal where they got sick. And that could be everybody in the church. Well, that seems wrong in the context of a church, right? And so that's why states adopted these statutes over the last 150 years to say, okay, no. The members of this church or this organization, Of course, the church is going to be liable as a church. It's got assets. It needs to pay damages. But the agents, the people who are working for the church, or the owners of a business, or the members, they're protected from this kind of liability unless they acted on their own. If they were just acting under the sort of doing what churches do, they're not liable themselves individually. The church is. And that's really important protection. And I'm really glad that we have that for our churches. It's even been now, corporations became so ubiquitous, so prolific, that now, even if you don't have a corporation, most states are going to say that, you know what, we're going to treat it like there is one, even if there's not. Now, if you do have a corporation, most states require you to have a set of bylaws in addition to your articles of incorporation. And in my experience, most churches do not have bylaws. Methodist churches tend to say the Book of Discipline is their bylaws. I don't think that's a good idea. You probably want to talk to an attorney and talk to your conference office about maybe seeing if they have templates for bylaws for a local church that would comply with Louisiana law. Now, that's corporate law, the nonprofit corporation statute in your state. It actually is semi-related, but has very little to do with what's called tax exempt status, which I'll talk about now. You have certainly heard the language 501c3. 501c3 has nothing to do with your corporate status. You can be a varying kinds of organizations and have a 501c3 tax exemption. 501c3 is a federal law. It's 26 USC 501 subsection C subsection 3. It's federal tax law. It's part of the Internal Revenue Code, and it essentially says that organizations that are organized solely for certain purposes, charitable purposes, one of which is religious, are tax exempt. They don't have to pay income tax under federal law. Well, the United Methodist Church, actually, it's possible under 501c3 for organizations to file a document with the IRS that says, we want to be included under 501c3, and we want official recognition that we are tax exempt. Well, the United Methodist Church had applied many, many years ago for all of its churches. General Council of Finance and Administration maintains what's called a blanket letter ruling, and you can actually get sort of an official inclusion into that blanket letter ruling for you, your local church, by going to the website that I listed. Actually, I think you can also go to just gcfa.org. GCFA has, and it's all online. You can actually fill it out. You'll need your church's employer identification number. That's a federal tax ID number. You're going to need your things like your church's address, and you need your GCFA number, which most churches, the business folks in most churches know. And you can go in and fill it out, and in moments, they will send you by email an official document that says, yep, your church is included in the blanket letter ruling. If you get an error message, you know you need to call your conference office in GCFA because there's some hitch in the system. Oftentimes, it's an issue with the GCFA number or an incorrect employer identification number that got associated with the church. So that's 501c3 tax exempt status. It means you don't have to pay federal income tax. However, there are some things you have to avoid, and these are some of the pitfalls I was talking about. First of all, not just churches, any 501c3 tax exempt organization must avoid private inurement. What is private inurement? Private inurement is the idea that some insider in the organization has benefited individually from the funds of the organization itself. And so where does this come up? It comes up especially with respect to organizations that illegally move money to their leader's pocketbook. Leader doesn't pay taxes on it. The organization shouldn't have given it. It's private inurement. Now, big exception to private inurement, reasonable compensation. You can pay your pastor a salary. Of course you can pay salary. We want you to pay salary to your pastors. So you have to avoid certain things that you may not be really comfortable avoiding. Number one is this rule means you can't give gifts to your pastors and staff. You can pay them reasonable compensation. You can, and reasonable is pretty broad. So that means if you take up a love offering to give to your pastor, that's well and good. But that love offering needs to be reported to the pastor on his or her W-2 because it's not a gift. It's compensation. Otherwise, if it's a gift, it's a form of private inurement. And under section 170, 26 USC 170, if you allow money to privately inure to an insider, to someone like the pastor can be in trouble with the IRS for tax evasion, and the church can actually lose its tax exempt status. Doesn't happen often. The IRS doesn't scrutinize churches, but it has before. And when it's really egregious, the IRS gets very aggressive in hunting this down. So be very careful. No gifts, only compensation. Please don't tell your pastor that I said you should never give them anything. No, you should give them, you should pay them fairly. You should probably even give them a bonus once in a while. Just report the bonus on their W-2 because it's compensation, not a gift. Another thing, churches just can't do this. A donor cannot go to the church admin and say, hey, I really love, our director of student ministries. I want to give him or her $1,000, but I want to run it through the church. No. It's not a tax deductible gift because it's a gift to an individual. It's just doing something indirectly that wouldn't otherwise be permitted directly. But B, unless that $1,000 gets counted as compensation, which means that PPR needs to be aware of it and finance needs to be aware of it, and it needs to be reported on the W-2, it's not permissible. It's got to be done as compensation or it can't be done. It is a bad idea to run gifts through the church to individuals of any sort. Now you may say, but wait, what about benevolences? Yeah, churches may give benevolences. They need to avoid giving it to staff people, should never give a benevolence to a staff person or the pastor. If they've run into a hardship in life, like a fire, then people can give individual gifts to them. And I would say the church could give them extra pay, but it's taxable pay. Benevolences are things given to those in need who are outside the church. And if you're going to give benevolences as a practice, you need to have a solid policy in place, a policy that says when you're going to give benevolences and to whom and who makes the decision. You need caps on how much gets given. You need a sort of a committee, like it could be the church council or the finance committee, or maybe a subcommittee of those groups. You need to have a committee that looks at and reviews it, say once a quarter, and says, yep, these all look good, these benevolences that were given, we approve of them. But that way you put safeguards around the practice. I'll give you my first recommendation for a resource. Richard Hammer is an author, very popular in church administration circles. He's an attorney. He puts out every year. I think he's actually got staff doing it now. Richard's getting a lot older and he's got mostly staff working for him, but his organization puts out a great clergy and church tax guide every year. And they have a great section on benevolence policies. And I would encourage you to take a look at that if you're going to pay out benevolences to people. Another thing this means, and the business administrators on this presentation will be thrilled with what I said to the pastors on the presentation on Tuesday. This means that professional expense reimbursements are not compensation. They are purchases on behalf of the local church. And that means for the church to be buying things, it cannot be for a personal use by the pastor, and the church must get an adequate accounting. That means an itemized receipt. If you don't get an itemized receipt, you should not reimburse your pastor. End of story. The pastor needs to show the itemized receipt and explain what it's for. And if it's for a business purpose, you should reimburse the pastor for that purchase. But they have to have a legitimate business purpose. Another pitfall that churches land in, and I actually think churches don't hit this pitfall as often as what they are afraid they're going to hit it, but it comes up. And I feel like I can talk about this a bit more openly now that the most recent election is behind us. Look, 501c3, all 501c3 tax exempt entities, including churches, have to avoid. You are not allowed to participate or intervene in the political campaign of a candidate. You can't endorse a candidate. And the pastor needs to be very careful in the pulpit. Pastor should not say from the pulpit that his or her church should vote for a particular candidate. But it's complicated because churches they're absolutely allowed to work for ballot initiatives. In Missouri, we just had a couple of ballot initiatives and our churches got really involved in them. They both passed. Churches were really excited about it. However, if the initiative is really aligned with a candidate and it's really just about one particular candidate, then aligning yourself with the ballot initiative could be considered intervention or participation in a campaign for a candidate. And so you got to be careful with that. Now, pastors have their own First Amendment rights to speech. They can, as individuals, support a candidate. They can work on a political campaign, and you need to give them the space to do things like that. But they better be really careful about not giving the impression that they are speaking on behalf of the church. Pastors get to speak to the church, but not for the church. And the pastor cannot go around giving the impression that his or her church is endorsing a particular candidate. That can get the church and the pastor in a lot of hot water. Now, churches can do some lobbying. Lobbying is where you're actually talking to legislatures. I don't think a lot of our churches are doing this, maybe some. Lobbying, it is permissible, but there are limits on how much time and money can be spent on it. And if you get too aligned with a particular candidate or party, that can be a problem because it looks like participation in a candidate's campaign. This one, a lot of Methodist churches do have to think about. They get approached a lot by candidates, oftentimes for state office or for a local office. And the candidate will say, well, I want to have a candidate forum. Is that permissible in a local church? Can you use your space for candidate forums? The answer is yes, you can do that. But it has to be a forum, which means equal participation by all the candidates participating in the election. As long as you are not perceived as favoring one candidate over another, your building can be used for candidate forums. I served a church in St. Louis that had done it for years. It always made me nervous because they had done it for years because they had a relationship with a very well-known politician in the area who happened to be very ensconced in one particular political party. But that particular politician was actually very moderate and actually really did want all the parties participating. And so, yeah, the church actually had at every election had a candidate forum, and they had all the candidates and they all attended. But you want to be careful. Candidate forums are great and fine, but you cannot be aligned with one candidate or another too closely. I almost never do this, but I'm going to actually refer you to a resource. If you go to the Missouri Conference website, go to resources, go to Treasurer and Financial Resources on that website. Or if you just search for my name and webinars on churches and politics, The chancellor here in Missouri and I, he and I have known each other for a very long time. He actually works for the law firm where I used to work. He's extremely involved in politics. And we did together a whole webinar on churches and politics and talked about these in much more specific detail. And it was before the election. And so you can find that and kind of understand what your church is allowed to do and not do. Let's talk about your donations. You get donations, and under 26 USC 170, gifts to 501c3 organizations that are any organization operating solely for a religious purpose, they can be deducted by the donor if the donor itemizes deductions. That's gotten a lot harder these days. The standard deduction is pretty high. Again, you want to know all about that, watch my presentation from Tuesday. I talked a lot about it. However, on the church side of things, if a donor gives the church more than $250, the church has to give the donor a, quote, contemporaneous written acknowledgement. These are your giving statements. Churches have some grace for regular donors that donate over the course of the year. They don't have to give it immediately with every gift. They can wait, add up the gifts at the end of the year, and give a giving statement in January that lists all the gifts given. Nothing wrong with that at all. But you are required to give those giving statements out. As big of a pain as they are to create, you have to do it. So you do have to have this statement on your giving statements that nothing was given in exchange, because if it was given in exchange, you just sold the item. You did not, that was not a gift. The donor got something in return, and that's not acceptable. So if you don't meet this requirement for your donors, they can lose their deduction. You do not want big donors losing their deductions, and because that will lead them to decide not to give in the future. That is, I'm going to pause right there and take a look at the chat. I don't see any questions. I'm going to move on, but I'm going to stay in the realm of taxes. I want to talk a little bit about when churches are not exempt from taxes. And number one is not income tax, but payroll tax. Now, if your church has only one employee and it's the pastor, then you are exempt from payroll taxes. You don't have to worry about this. But if you have even one lay employee, you are required to withhold income tax, FICA, and Medicare, and pay them through a payroll tax return system. The payroll tax return form is called a 941. Now, I said, again, I went through a lot of this on Tuesday as well. If a church only has the pastor, it's exempt. Why? Because pastors are exempt from all withholdings and should not have FICA and Medicare withheld. That means the church is not matching the 7.65% on a pastor. Why? Because the pastor pays self-employment contributions. I get this question a lot. Well, do churches have to pay unemployment tax? You need to check with your own state Department of Labor, but generally churches are exempt from unemployment. And that means that when somebody leaves your employment, less for the pastor, more for lay employees, when a lay employee leaves employment, he or she is not eligible for unemployment benefits. Now, a lot of the COVID relief changed some of that. The extra unemployment was available to even people whose employers did not pay into the unemployment system for their state. But again, a lot of that's governed by state law, and you need to check with Louisiana specifically. Clergy, I said this, are exempt because they have to pay SECA, and they also, if you're not withholding for them, they need to file a quarterly payroll tax return. I went over all that on Tuesday. However, if the church has lay employees, and then especially if you have several lay employees and you've got a more sophisticated church staff, it is entirely permissible for the pastor to complete a W-4. That's the form that all lay staff have to fill out to get their withholdings correct. They mark exempt, so you don't withhold based on the tax tables that give you the amount you're supposed to withhold, but rather there's an extra withholding line. The pastor can fill that out with whatever amount the pastor would like. And you then, the church then withholds that much from the pastor, their paycheck, and you just send it in as part of the 941 return. I'd encourage you to check with your conference treasurer's office for assistance with that if you're not doing it. But that then sort of absolves the pastor from having to do the quarterly filing with the 1040 ES. The pastor can choose. Quarterly's fine, but as is this system of kind of what I call voluntarily withholdings using a W-4 in the 941. And that brings up clergy W-2s. Again, encourage you to watch Tuesday's presentation, but churches should not, when you're doing your clergy person's W-2, you do not withhold FICA and Medicare throughout the year. Pastors pay SECA, and that means on the W-2 that boxes 3, 4, 5, and 6 get zeros in the box. That may seem bizarre, but that's the right way to do it. Box 2, which is the amount for income tax withheld, also gets a 0 unless you've done this voluntary withholding. Then the amount that you withheld goes in box 2. I get this question all the time. Well, what about their housing? Housing is exempt from income tax for pastors. It doesn't go in box 1 at all. You are permitted as a church to put any housing allowance, the amount paid, also the amount paid for utilities, into box 14, which is a miscellaneous box with a simple note of housing. Now this, until just a few weeks ago, I guess, I was getting lots of questions from local churches about the codes for the W-2s. And so I actually listed a few of the most common ones for pastors on this slide. PIP, pre-tax contributions, doesn't go in box 1, it goes in box 12, and it gets code E. It's a 403B contribution. PIP Roth contributions gets code BB. If you have a strange animal, but if you get a PIP after tax contribution, it goes in box 1 and doesn't go in box 12 at all. And then group health, if you're paying into group health for the pastor or for lay employees on this one, it gets code D in box 12. And actually, most employers, and I think probably the vast majority of churches, are still exempt from having to worry about that code D code in box 12. They say it's coming one day where we'll have to do it, but we haven't yet. But it's not that difficult. You just put the amount contributed for the pastor for group health in box 12, and it gets code D. I'm again going to just pause and look at my chat to see if there are questions. I don't see any. So moving on. Oh, I went the wrong way. So I want to make a little interlude here. This is a really, when I do these workshops, I get lots of questions around this. So I just want to address it with a slide. I think most people in church administration, even pastors, have a pretty good idea of this. Employees in local churches get a W-2. That includes pastors. They get a W-2, not a 1099. Independent contractors get a 1099. And which is which? Well, it's actually hard to say which is which because the IRS applies a facts and circumstances test. But there are some key factors, things like who controls the schedule, who controls the work quality, who provides the tools, and how is the person paid? So all of these, I sort of gave you the answer as to which direction to go if you're not sure. But if you generally, if the church has more control over the schedule, the person looks like an employee. If the person controls their schedule, like the lawn guy, the lawn guy always chooses to mow the lawn on Monday rather than when you want it on Friday, that looks more like an independent contractor. The same with work quality. If the church oversees the quality, it's an employee. Now, and if the church provides the tools, it's an employee. If you're paying a salary or hourly wage rather than a fee charged by a contractor, that looks like an employee. So let's do some examples. Things like musicians, an organist. Well, it depends a little, But if you say to the organist, you must be here on Sunday morning at 10 a.m., and you must be at choir practice on Tuesday nights at 6, and we'll pay you, I don't know, $75 an hour for the 4 hours that we expect you to work in a week. And the director of music oversees the quality. That really looks like an employee, not an independent contractor. Now, you can make arguments in either case, and most of the time the IRS will leave you alone. But just remember, the safe harbor is to make the person an employee, withhold FICA, withhold Medicare, withhold income tax, and give them a W-2 rather than a 1099. I'm going to pause again to see if there are questions about this one. Let me give a word. I did this on Tuesday as well about clergy compensation. Really, I think you can just follow this slide in order. There are a couple of things to note. First, housing. It's exempt from income tax, but it is still clergy compensation, and that includes the value of the parsonage. Other amounts that are withheld before salary and income tax are also part of clergy compensation, as are the benefits that are paid on the pastor's behalf. However, and I said this very clearly to the pastors, professional expenses and continuing ed, that's not compensation. That's a church budget for what the church are willing for the pastor to spend on the church's behalf in doing certain ministries. So if the church wants the pastor to drive his or her own car to the hospital, the church should be willing to pay mileage on that car. Why? Because the pastor is putting wear and tear and using gas that the pastor otherwise has to pay for. The pastor is paying money on behalf of the church, and the church should pay mileage for that. The same with other professional expenses. But I said very clear to the pastor, when the pastor buys something for the church, then it belongs to the church. That includes things like computers. So if the pastor gets reimbursed for a computer, the computer belongs to the local church, not the pastor. That's really important, again, because of that private inurement stuff that I talked about earlier. Pause one more time for questions around clergy compensation. Excellent. You all are an easy group. Another area that churches are not exempt. This is an area that sort of rose to prominence after tax reform in 2017-18. It's kind of faded back. It rose to prominence because there was this weird rule affecting parking lots that got repealed, thankfully. But here's the idea. It said this: gifts given to churches, that income to churches, that's all exempt from federal income tax. But any income earned from an unrelated business, that's not exempt from income tax, and the church has to pay income tax on it with a form called a 990T. This is called unrelated business income or unrelated business income tax, UBIT. Now, what is unrelated business income? I gave the definition up here. It's not substantially related to the charitable, education, or other purpose that is the business of the organization's exemption. So if a church is essentially running a business and getting income from that business that's not related to worship, that's not related to Christian education, it's not on how you use the income, it's on the actual, what the business is like. So if you are selling things, that's not related to your religious purpose. That could trigger unrelated business income. Now, some exceptions that you can breathe a sigh of relief. Income from rent on property that's not encumbered with debt. In other words, your parsonage, if you don't have a mortgage on that parsonage and you're renting it to a tenant, IRS says it's still not unrelated business income. That's a bit of a random rule, but that's the rule. If you have gone out and bought a building you bought it, you financed it with debt, and you get rent from that, that does trigger unrelated business income. Income from sales that are carried out primarily by volunteers or that consist of primarily donated items, that's exempt from UBIT. You don't have to worry about it. So the charity auction that you do where everybody donates stuff, you're fine, especially if volunteers are running it. However, I've known some churches that they started like a rummage sale. Well, that rummage sale ministry like exploded in growth. People love a rummage sale in Missouri for some reason. And it got to the point where the church hired somebody to run the rummage sale. And they were not just selling things donated by members. They were going out and buying things like used CDs and DVDs and selling those. That is now starting to look like it could be subject to unrelated business income. Some pitfalls, I've talked about those. Oh, parking lot and space rentals. So a parking lot lease does not produce rent according to the IRS. It's a fee for service, and therefore, even if you don't have a mortgage on your parking lot, if you're getting income from renting space to the neighbors, that could trigger UBIT. T-shirt sales where you've bought the t-shirts. This hits my annual conference. We have to file. We never owe because there are enough exemptions, but we end up having to file a 990T because we buy t-shirts and sell them at annual conference, and we're not looking to make money. We break even. But you get the idea. We have a magazine and we charge subscriptions and we charge for ads in that magazine. All of that subject to unrelated business income tax. Now, the good news is, even if you file, like I said, we never owe in the conference, but we have to file something to think about. And you need to see a tax professional if you think your church owns UBIT. Let's shift gears and move to employment law, talk about the Fair Labor Standards Act. First of all, Fair Labor Standards Act governs hours and wages of employees. And there's talk of changing this right now, although it's made big news. It doesn't look like it's going to happen in the near future where they're raising the minimum wage. But the Fair Labor Standards Act essentially says, one, everybody in the United States must get paid the federal minimum wage. Your state may have a higher one. I have no idea. Missouri has a significantly higher minimum wage than the federal minimum wage. And two, if you work more than 40 hours in a week, you must receive overtime. Everyone is covered by this, even church employees. The federal government's been very clear that churches are covered. There are only exemptions for employees. And I've listed them. And as you can see, most of them are not going to apply to churches. Now, good news, the First Amendment probably exempts clergy. And the Department of Labor under both Democrat and Republican administrations has recognized that exemption of clergy for now. And I think it will hold under the current administration. But the rest of the exemptions probably aren't going to count, aren't going to cover. Executive, quite honestly, the pay threshold to qualify for that exemption is so high, none of our clergy and none of our employees in our local churches are going to get counted. I'm going to skip administrative because it's the one that might apply. Professionals are people with a credential, lawyers, accountants who are CPAs. They can get exempted, but there are rules. We'll see the rule in a minute. If you have an IT professional, they might be exempted. And then outside sales, again, probably doesn't apply to churches. Maybe an IT professional if you're a very large church, maybe a professional if you have a CPA on staff, or like the conference in Missouri, an attorney on staff. But most of these just won't count for churches. The administrative exemption might count. It's not an administrative assistant. An administrative employee is somebody who has responsibilities for oversight of a budget or employees. A supervisor, if you will. They're white collar employees. They are exempt. And the exemptions are determined by job description, education requirements, and this is the big one, actual compliance. You can't put in a job description that the job is going to be exempt under the administrative exemption, but then not actually give the person the budget or employee oversight that the job description said they'd have. You have to actually do it. Now, they also require a salary threshold. And this got lots of news back in 2016. It got undone by the courts. And then what was, I thought, fascinating was everybody thought that the Trump administration was vastly more conservative than the Obama administration. And really, the Trump administration adopted extremely similar rules. The salary threshold was slightly lower, but it was pretty similar. So if you have an administrative employee, somebody who has oversight over staff, so we'll see in a minute, somebody like a preschool director, in order to be exempt from the minimum wage and the overtime rules, they must make at least $684 a week. That's $35,568 annually. But again, beware, the salary's irrelevant if the job description and compliance don't actually fit an exemption. Administrative employees must have supervisory authority. They're managers. The choir director might be, maybe, if they're supervising the organist, if they're overseeing the music budget. Well, what about youth directors? Well, it's going to depend. If they're clergy, then maybe, then certainly First Amendment. But if they're not clergy, if they're lay staff, you are riding a fine line. And I always get asked, but what about mission trips? They work more than 40 hours. I was a youth director once, and I can attest, yes, a youth director works more than 40 hours on a mission trip. The rule is you must pay them overtime. Here's the good news. It just means you need a little bit of intentionality and attentiveness. It means that the youth director needs to make sure he or she has enough volunteers that allows him or her to take breaks over the course of the mission trip. In other words, they are not on the clock 24 hours a day. They might be on the clock 12, 14 hours a day, but when they're sleeping, they're off the clock. When they're on a 2 or 3 hour break to take a nap, they're off the clock. Just set up a schedule and have the youth director fill out timesheets, because that's the rule. If you're not exempt, have to pay them the minimum wage. You have to pay them overtime if they work more than 40 hours. Remember, it's more than 40 hours. So even if you hire a 20-hour-a-week employee, you pay them a salary, and they, sometimes they work 30 hours. As long as you break down the hour to the salary is more than the minimum wage. If they're only working 30 hours, they never trigger the overtime rule. It's only if they exceed 40 hours does overtime count. If they work overtime over 40 hours, they must get time and a half. Say, well, can you give them comp time? Yeah, you can, but it's got to be in the same period. In other words, it has to reduce the worked hours to 40 hours or less. So if somebody works 10 hours a day, say during Holy Week for 4 days, you can give them off on Good Friday and they're still at 40 hours. You can also schedule your work weeks. You don't have to start a work week on a Monday. You can start a work week on a Wednesday. It's actually what my annual conference office does, because we have so many weekend activities. Our work week actually starts on Thursday. That way, if somebody has worked more than up to 40 hours by Sunday afternoon, we can give them Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday off and save the overtime. Now, sometimes we just pay overtime, but you get the idea. And I do think it's important when the rules changed back in 2016, I did a lot of webinars on this and churches got really worked up. I think it's important to remember we're talking about paying people fairly. And I think it's important to remember that these rules are not that restrictive. They are requiring you to do something that arguably the church should be doing anyway. But I do understand that the administration of it is a little bit tricky. Well, let's take what we've just learned with sort of the corporate tax stuff and then the Fair Labor Standards stuff, and let's apply it to preschools and Mother's Day out programs. And let's look specifically at some pitfalls. First of all, let's look at some pitfalls around staffing. First, the Fair Labor Standards Act applies. It especially applies to just your preschool teachers who have no administrative oversight. You may have an administrative exemption for the director if that director has hiring and firing authority and budgetary authority over the staff. But otherwise, you have to pay them at least the minimum wage for the hours they work, and you have to pay them time and a half for overtime rules. Be really wary about making preschool or Mother's Day out staff independent contractors. I'd say the same about nursery workers. They typically have a schedule provided by the church. They typically get an hourly wage. They usually get some time off. And the church provides the supplies, the toys, the diapers. That makes them look like employees to me. And that's the safe harbor anyway. Be wary about making them independent contractors. Issue 2, this is an issue near and dear to my heart as I was a corporate attorney, corporate structure. The issue here is really one of liability, as in, will the action of the preschool create a liability for the church itself? You have 2 options to deal with this. The preschool or the Mother's Day Out program could just be the church. It's the church operating it. It's a church ministry. There's one corporation. Now, theoretically, you could have a separate corporation, but it's all the same organization with the same leaders, and the church should have complete control over the acts of that corporation. One employer ID number. Again, theoretically, you can separate it, but it's still the church that's in control. And it means there's one insurance policy. Even if the preschool has its own existence as a corporation, you may name it as an additional insured, and that's one single policy, but it's really the church's insurance. Now, are there risks in that? Of course there are, but it's a good ministry, and the benefits of having just one corporation that is both church and preschool is that the church leaders have clear control and can mitigate the liability risks. They can have good insurance, make sure they can review it and have good insurance. They can set policies around how the teachers and the volunteers operate with respect to the kids. The church leaders can be intentional about the legal relationships with the children and their parents. Another option, this is probably the safest option for liability, but it really means the church isn't doing a preschool, it's hosting a preschool. The preschool could be wholly separate and simply renting space. That means there are 2 corporations, each with their own leaders. They may or may not be members of the church. The preschool corporation board members may or may not be members of the church. There are 2 separate IRS employer ID numbers and 2 separate insurance policies. But how do you make sure that the preschool liabilities don't flow over to the church? Well, you have a good lease. The preschool has signed a lease. This is really an independent preschool renting space in the church building. You have good indemnification language. I'll talk about that a little later if we have time. And the idea is it protects the church and the preschool too from the liabilities of the other organization. The risk in this is mixing options. I see this all the time in local churches. They'll have separate corporate entities that don't relate, but then they'll share an employer ID number or an insurance policy. That just means the church is going to end up responsible for an organization it's not controlling. Or worse, I think, they have one corporate entity, but 2 different accountants, EINs, books, payrolls, and the preschool kind of operates on its own. It hires its own people. It's got its own board. But that just means that the church then is going to have all the liabilities of that preschool and have no ability to screen staff, to set policies. Mixing like that is really dangerous. If the church is going to own a ministry like a preschool, they need to really own it, and they need to take responsibility for it. Again, intentionality and attentiveness. I would actually add the same right now. There's a lot of talk around Boy Scouts and their bankruptcy. The same principle goes for Boy Scout troops. If the church charters a Boy Scout troop, it needs to really own it. And that troop needs to fall under all the policies set for youth ministry and children's ministry in that local church. And it needs to have church leaders who are participating in leadership of the troop for all the same reasons with the preschool. I'm going to pause right there before I move on to see if there are questions, because I know that preschools are a hot topic, as are Boy Scout troops. Right. Let's talk a little bit about real estate. First, let me give you a quick lesson in real estate. When you own a piece of real estate, churches tend to own their property. You own a metaphoric bundle of sticks. So think of the ownership of the real estate like a bundle of sticks, and each stick represents the various rights and privileges, even responsibilities of owning a piece of property. So the ability to build on that property, that's a stick. The ability to sell it, that's a stick. Well, these are fancy lawyer words. Fee simple title means that you have given or sold the entire bundle to someone else. And the document that conveys fee simple title is called a deed. Well, it's actually possible to separate the sticks. And actually, that's what happens when you lease property. You take the sticks representing occupancy and the ability to enter, and you give it to someone else in exchange for a regular payment of money. That's called rent. That's a lease. And it's temporary. It will go away at the end of a year or 3 years or sometimes 30 days. You take the stick back and they don't get to occupy anymore. A reversion is actually related to ownership. It essentially gives all the sticks in that bundle to someone else, but says, hey, if you stop doing X, or if you start doing X, I can go in and take that bundle back from you. And oftentimes church deeds have reversion clauses in them. I'm not talking about the trust clause yet. I'll get there. This is when a family has conveyed church property to the church and said, they had to have had permission of the annual conference to do it at the time, but they've said, you can use it so long as you use it for a United Methodist Church. And if you stop using it as a United Methodist Church, the family gets the property back. Well, there are a couple of different kinds of deeds that you probably need to know about. First, a quitclaim deed. Second, a warranty deed. And a warranty deed, it's giving all the sticks and making a promise. And the promise is, I really own all the sticks that I'm selling you right now. I can really do it. A quitclaim deed says, I'm going to give you any sticks if I have any. So guess what? Here's how this works. I am willing, anybody on this webinar that's willing to give me $100, I will give you a quitclaim deed to the Empire State Building. And I'll even record it in New York. Because it's a quitclaim deed, I made you no promise that I actually own the Empire State Building. There's nothing wrong with doing that. I will not give you a warranty deed to the Empire State Building because it's a shocker, I don't own it. That's the difference. So here's a question. Who owns the United Methodist Church? Is it in fee simple title? The answer is the local church. Typically, there are exceptions, but typically the local church owns its own property. And you can say that really it is in fee simple, but one stick was held back actually it was taken by the local church and it was handed to the annual conference. And that stick says, if you stop using that property as a local United Methodist Church, The whole bundle of sticks goes to the annual conference trustees. That's the trust clause. There are other things that are covered, that the Book of Discipline regulates a local church's ability to enter into leases, mortgages, mineral rights, things like that. You need to be familiar. I would encourage you to look at the sections. If you're working on church property stuff, look at the 2500s of the Book of Discipline. Zoning and building codes. Actually, the annual conference isn't the only party that gets a stick when you buy a piece of property as a local church. The municipality in which you operate may well do so also. Zoning laws essentially control the way owners of buildings can use their property. So it's entirely possible that you buy a piece of property that you plan to put a church on, but it's not zoned for that kind of use. If it's not, then the church, in order to have a church on it, must go to the zoning authority and get what's called a variance. And they don't have to give it to you. Beware of zoning laws. Now, a lot of zoning laws, you are grandfathered in. That's the language, and that's a real thing. If you were a church before the zoning law was imposed, even if you're not in an area zoned for your use, you can keep using it as outside the zoning law. But be careful, because if you suddenly make a change, if you suddenly convey your property, if you try to, maybe change up the ownership somehow, you could trigger the zoning laws now. The same with building codes. Oftentimes, building codes get triggered. The churches are grandfathered under building codes, and that's great right up until the point where they do a renovation. And the renovation requires a building permit, and that permit is sent to be issued, requires that the church bring the whole building into compliance. That can really get expensive. Let's talk a little bit about building uses and policies. So this got really tricky during the pandemic, because all of a sudden you had buildings that had been used by lots of different groups. Churches got nervous, groups got nervous. There were lots of questions on building uses and policies. First of all, if you have a group that is occupying your building on a kind of a permanent basis, or even not permanent, it's sort of on a fixed basis, they're in there every day, or they're in there 4 days a week, you don't need a building use agreement, you need a lease. And they're similar. They're very similar documents and agreements with similar issues. But regardless, you need to be clear on term. Even if the term is 3 hours on a Saturday afternoon, it needs to be clear. They can enter at 1 p.m. and they must depart by 4 p.m. so that the custodians can clean for Sunday morning. It needs to be clear on how much is being paid for this, on the rent. And actually what space can be occupied. Do they get the whole use of the building or just a particular area? Any conditions, when they leave, the vacancies, if it is a lease, when they leave and they leave it vacant. And anybody who's going to be using your church building, other than like members who are individuals, any organization outside the church that's using the building, they need to have their own insurance. They need to provide the church evidence of that insurance, and they need to provide what I talked about earlier, indemnification. It essentially says that they'll protect you if their guests are injured while on the property. They need to name the church as what's called an additional insured. That is, they essentially in their insurance policy say, hey, if something goes wrong during this use, we're going to name the local church as also insured under our policy. I'll pause there. See if there are questions. I don't see any. Check my time. We are almost finished. Last thing I want to talk about are contracts. Contracts, in my experience, churches, they have lots of contracts and they don't even think about it. There are contracts like copier leases I mentioned, IT service agreements, HVAC service agreements, alarm company agreements. I had a knockdown, drag out fight with an alarm company when I was serving a church as a pastor, because the truth was we didn't need the alarm where we were located, and they were charging us a fortune to stay in this agreement, and we weren't really getting anything out of it. But we had a contract, and breaking that contract was difficult. So anytime before you sign a document, read it. Even if you don't have a lawyer review it, read it, understand what you're signing, know how long the term is, know if it automatically renews. That was the problem with the alarm company, by the way. The agreement automatically renewed for 5 years. I didn't want it for 1 more year, let alone 5. Know when they renew, know how they renew and for how long, and know what you have to do to prevent the renewal if you don't want it to continue. That's especially true of copier leases. You are leasing a copier, and by the time that the term is up, and especially if you go through a couple of renewal terms, the copier is probably going to be obsolete. And I will tell you, copier companies will not let you out. It is a fight every time. They'll let you out if you rent the next most expensive copier. That's generally their policy. Know what the fee is, know how much you have to pay, know liability limitations. You may sign a document that says that you're limiting the vendor's liability to only the amount paid. Well, what if that vendor comes on and, commits a gross act of negligence? You may not want that liability limit. And if there's no way around it, at least know you've got it so that you can put other protections in place. Take a look at the insurance and indemnification language, at least in certain contracts like leases. Know who owns what. And that's really tricky for intellectual property. If you sign something with a designer to create a new logo, create a church website, who owns the intellectual property? Is the church getting it, or is the designer keeping it and letting the church use it? You really need to understand how that works in order to avoid a problem in the future. Because typically what happens is all of a sudden you decide to stop paying the web designer who also maintains the website, and they say, well, thank you very much. I'll have the website taken down at noon on Friday. And you say, well, wait, I didn't want it to go down at noon. Sorry, I own it. Know who owns what so that you can go in understanding what the issues might be. Well, I'm going to pause there again. I'm sort of to the end of my materials that I have planned, but I want to definitely, let's do this. If there are questions about anything I've covered, or if you have a question that I didn't talk about that you were just itching to have, go ahead. You're welcome to put that in the chat. And if I don't see any, then I'll just offer a word of closing and offer a prayer for everybody for the day. All right. Well, I don't see any questions. I hope I'm not missing anything there. Again, I so appreciate. Oh, actually, now I do see a chat. Oh, I had just a thank you. Well, let me do this. Let me offer a prayer for everybody. This was recorded, so you're welcome to come back and revisit it. And I think that my slides are going to be available to everybody. And just shamelessly, I do have a book out that covers a lot of these topics and several others, including things like church budgets and church accounting and things like that. It's called The Vile Practices of Church Leadership. I didn't pick the title. Abingdon picked the title, but it's out from Abingdon Press. You could get it at any major bookseller, Cokesbury, or the other one where everybody actually gets their books these days. I so appreciate my time with you guys in Louisiana. Again, let me offer a closing prayer for you and for your churches. Gracious God, I give you thanks for this day. I give you thanks for these folks who devote themselves to service in their churches. I give you thanks for the United Methodist Church, for our bishops and our district superintendents, our clergy, and the laity who drive the ministries forward. God, I pray that you pour out your Spirit on your church. Pray that you prepare the ground for the seeds that we will plant. Pray for wisdom and insight for the days ahead. pray for all the uncertainty, for those who are sick, for those who are struggling. I pray all this in Christ's holy name. Amen. Well, thank you all so much, and that concludes our webinar.